Okay, so welcome back. And for this last module video here, I want to get into the geography of some of these conservation and biodiversity issues. And this is really where biogeography becomes really a valuable tool in looking at conservation issues. And that's because biodiversity varies geographically, so too does the risk of extinction and endangerment. And so, there's a geographic component to diversity, and so there's a geographic component to the risk of extinction and endangerment across different species. One of those is the geographic range. So here we're seeing the extinction rates of marine bivalves and gastropods that are along the Atlantic and Gulf coastal plains of North America during the late Cretaceous. And what we can see is that extinction, obviously this isn't necessarily related to humans, but just extinction rate in general. We can see that the extinction rate for is higher, and it's altered depending on the range extent or the size of the geographic range. So those groups of species that have larger geographic ranges exhibited a greater proportion of species going extinct during this time period compared to species that had smaller geographic ranges. So that's something interesting, and how range size can contribute to extinction risk a little bit. Mammals and birds show a really strong geographic bias in extinction, and so basically you're seeing extinctions, mammal extinctions since 1500 and bird extinctions in very similar areas, and they're basically clustered around areas that have really high levels of biodiversity, but also really high levels of endemicity and tend to be highly isolated areas. And if we want to look, you can break this down into different types, and what's going to stick out is basically habitat modification having a disproportionately large effect, or being disproportionately common as a reason for extinction of these types of organisms. Here we're looking at the causes of extinctions from about a 400-year period, just about, and compared to very recent endangerment in selected groups of animals. If we look at historical extinctions, we're breaking them down by types here. Except for mollusks, it's pretty evenly split across these groups as far as whether it was hunting or introduced species or habitat destruction. Obviously, mollusks being much more skewed towards habitat destruction. But if we look at recent endangerments, you see a much more heavy bias in habitat construction, or sorry, habitat destruction across most of these groups. Mollusks, actually, I don't know if that's a good sign, but mollusks seem to be going extinct for or endangered for other reasons more recently, as opposed to these others where it's almost always habitat destruction that's the largest contributor to being an endangered species. Historical trends. Here we're looking at historical trends in the number of islands and mainland extinctions. And this is over time. And basically you're seeing this trend, an interesting trend, where up until about 1900 or the late 1800s, most of the extinctions were on continental in continental environments and compared to island environments. And around 1800, you see this big increase. First of all, big increase in the continental, but then basically a shift in decreasing continental extinctions and increasing island extinctions, starting about the turn of the 1800s into the 1900s there. So an interesting trend where lots of expansion going on, and maybe continental expansion had started to maybe actually slow down as humans have become more common on most continents and have started to expand maybe to more isolated parts of the globe. Um, Also, there's been the clearing of primary forests across the globe has been a pretty destructive trend throughout, pretty much throughout a lot of human history. So here we're seeing the tropical and temperate former historical extents of these forests and the current extent, and pretty much anywhere you look, if you compare the current to the original, either tropical or temperate, you're seeing a decrease in the geographic extent of these forests. And that's not new. I mean, that's pretty much what humans do when we move into an area, is clear the forest, for a lot of reasons, for resources, but also historically forests have been, sort of the wilderness, and people wanted to remove that. And so there's lots of reasons, but also the resources of wood and things like that, has contributed to this. And there's been, I should have included a slide on more recent trends. Obviously deforestation is still happening, but there's much more nuance in the geography of where it's happening. Obviously a lot of it's still happening in tropical areas. Some areas of deforestation has leveled off, so I think there's some interesting geographical trends going on there, and I wish I had taken the time. Now I realize I didn't. But anyway, it's still a problem globally. And we can look at different examples throughout the 1900s. Here we're going back to Olympic National Forest, and again you're seeing sort of a shrinkage of the extent of the geographic range, but also the increasing sort of clearing out within the geographic range as our technologies got better, and our timber harvesting practices became more efficient. You can see that, from 1945 to 65 to 85. Around this time, I think they actually implemented some bans and prohibited logging in Olympic National Forest. Here in Wisconsin, seeing very similar trends. This is going back even earlier. Of course, Wisconsin is more central than Olympic National Forest, and as Europeans moved west across North America, we tended to deforest our way as we went. But this isn't obviously just exclusive to the United States. Here in England, more deforest trends, and this is, going back pretty far to, the year 400 to 1086 to 1650 to 1960. Some dramatic changes there. Here in Borneo, Indonesia, from 1950 to 1985 to 2000, 2005, 2010, and 2020. Pretty dramatic changes in the extent of those forests as well. So there's, it's a problem globally, but it's also a problem, lots of specific areas that this has been occurring. If we look at the geography of endangerment and principal threats to terrestrial and marine species globally, we can see that there are some sort of hotspots. Basically in terrestrial areas in the South Pacific here, we can see some high levels of endangerment. And, there's lots of endemicity, there's lots of biodiversity in these regions, so that's not surprising. Marine environments, the Arctic has some high levels of endangerment as well. And these are just sort of relative. I'm not sure exactly what these metrics, it's just sort of meant to convey relative levels of how much endangerment there is among those communities. But if we break it up, there's more geographic nuance if we break it up by type. So we look at habitat loss, lots of habitat loss in South America, Central Africa, but also in that Indo-Pacific region. Harvesting is a problem in that area, but also throughout, almost all the pelagic zones in the ocean marine environments. There's also accidental, there's perhaps, species that go extinct for reasons that it's sort of a byproduct of human activities that's maybe not related to something else, but still occurs, is a factor in marine environments. And then pollution as well in certain areas of marine, especially coastal areas in marine environments. So lots of different reasons that are contributing to these nuanced geographical patterns of species endangerment and extinctions. There's also these things, a phenomenon called range collapse that we see in lots of different species. So here are some patterns of range collapse. This is for notable species like the giant panda here, which has seen a large range collapse. The historical range you're seeing here in the green, and then the white is sort of the current extent. And so large range collapse there. The red wolf in the southeastern United States had a large historical range and now is just found here. What is this? It's a ferret. I think it's the black-footed ferret. Had a very large geographic range across some of the plains and southeastern states of the United States, and now is only found here. So really dramatic examples of range collapse in some of these mammals. Not just mammals though. Here's the range collapse of the American burying beetle, the Komodo dragon, and Hawaiian birds, all exhibiting similar trends where they were really widespread and then collapse. And what usually happens here is that when you see a species that experiences dramatic range collapse, they usually are collapsing to the most isolated parts of their range. That's usually where they retreat to. And that's probably a product of where that's, the places where humans end up going last. And if you remember back to how our patterns of resource use tends to be, we go to isolated places last as well. And so if you're retreating or being reduced and collapsing back to those areas, that would make sense if it's in response to human activity. Something else, sometimes it's in response to an introduced species. So this is the brown tree snake in Guam that was introduced in the late 1940s, and you're seeing this range collapse of a number of different species, from this fruit bat to this rail and broadbills and these other crow species and other bird species, I think, where this introduced species just basically preyed on these things that had never experienced this type of species before. This is, I think, the range collapse of a moth species in the northeastern United States. And then if you're familiar with your environmental history, another one in the United States you might be familiar with is the chestnut, in response to chestnut blight in the 1900s. So lots of examples of introduced species that can cause this sort of range collapse. And actually, range collapse is something that happens with humans too. So if we look at a good example of this is sort of if we look at the once vast range of the Inca Empire collapsed to its final strongholds that were isolated in mountain sites of Machu Picchu and Vilcabamba, in response to the Spanish conquistadors making their way through these areas. So basically they had this entire area and collapsed to these very isolated areas where they were able to sort of remain hidden from the Spanish conquistadors. But that's a very similar sort of thing, and if you consider this sort of a geographic range of this empire, then that is sort of very characteristic of a range collapse scenario. Another troubling trend is that we tend to pollute a lot. I mean, it should probably not news that humans produce pollution, plastic pollution in particular. Here you're seeing the concentration of plastic debris globally, and you can see that it's very non-random. We emit, and plastic pollution comes from all over the place and usually finds its way into the ocean, and then it gets clustered in these areas, basically around 30 degrees south and 30 degrees north. And this figure shows that really, really clearly, where you can see the plastic concentration on the x-axis, latitude. On the y-axis, you see these clusters at the 30-degree latitude, absolute latitude of north and south. And basically that's just the result of very non-random ocean circulation patterns that cluster these things together. So that's a pattern that we see, and obviously has pretty strong geographic trends. Something else is these hypoxic systems that create these dead zones near coasts that currently tend to concentrate in continental shelves that are adjacent to areas with high human impact, probably related to agricultural runoff and alterations to the nutrient balances in these types of environments can create these hypoxic sort of dead zones where you get a rapid increase in the oxygen demand and decrease in how much is available, and so that creates these dead zones in coastal environments. And so they're mapping these out in correlation to the human footprint. So how much disturbed an area is, or how impacted it is by human activity. And you can see pretty clearly those tend to line up really well. Going back to this idea of invasive species or introducing species, the richness of established introduced birds is very non-random, highly non-random, reflecting patterns of colonization and development by humans. If we look at areas that have received the most introduced bird species, the United States pops out very clearly, and portions of Canada, basically North America, the British England and the United Kingdom, and then Australia. So really pretty much just highlighting the areas of Western European colonial expansion and empires, and Europe as a whole kind of pops out a little bit. But what you can really see it clearly in some of these figures, where if we look at the distribution of the native ranges of all birds here by latitude, basically you get this nice even bell distribution or normal distribution around the equator, where around the equator there's a lot of species, which there's just more species there in general because of the biodiversity. But you get this sort of trend. And if we look at the native ranges of all birds that are used in introductions, basically birds that are taken somewhere else, we get a similar looking, it's a little bit more spread out, but still peaking near the equator, even though it's a little bit flatter. Where you get an interesting difference here is if you look at the sites receiving introduction. So these are sites where birds have been introduced to. Then you get this bimodal distribution where basically it peaks around 25 to 30 latitude, basically a temperate latitude. So basically we're taking species from these areas and introducing them to these other areas. We're like, oh, these species are cool, so we're going to take them to where we're at, pretty much. And we're altering some of those relationships where if the isolation, if we look at these populations of bird species or the number of species, sorry, the diversity, we can see normally you would expect this type of relationship according to island biogeography, but we're seeing this sort of relationship where there's more species introduced as isolation increases there. And you can't, we talked about plastic pollution, but we can't really ignore the big elephant in the room, that is atmospheric pollution. Here we're seeing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases and changes in land and ocean surface temperatures. If you're going to talk about humans altering the environment, you can't really not talk about climate change. And it should not be news to any of you that there's been a dramatic increase, an exponential increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases like CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, all corresponding to the increase in the burning of fossil fuels by humans. And this increase in these concentrations corresponds to an increase in the radiative forcing, which basically just means the warming that occurs as a result of that. So we increase these greenhouse gases and the global climate warms in response to that. And there's no controversy about this whatsoever. It's very clear that this is what's going on. And you can see in pretty much anything you want to look at, you're going to see a trend that's related to warming, and that warming is related to these greenhouse gases. So we can see the increase in temperature here, increasing in temperature. If you want to look at things like sea level has been rising and sea ice has been decreasing. What I should have included was some phenology stuff, like the length of the growing season and how things are. It's springtime right now, so things are warming up, and spring temperatures tend to be warming earlier. Basically, winter is getting shorter, and we can see in the phenology lots of things are leafing out earlier and flowering earlier. And so there's a great website called the National Phenology Network. If you want to look at that, they have some great maps that can show that the spring anomaly index and how early or late things are developing in terms of that. But yeah, so we can't really ignore the climate change, anthropogenic climate change that humans have been causing as well. Okay, so that's a wrap on that. I'm going to finish this up. There's one more reading, and it's about these huge tree planting projects. So Conservation and climate change issues have been in the news for a long time, years now, and there's something that usually gets a lot of media attention is these things like these huge tree planting projects. In the last few years, there's been even some scientific articles published saying, oh, we could plant these huge basically they do these huge tree planting projects where we're foresting for the first time lots of areas, and the thinking is that that would be beneficial because trees can sequester carbon, and that's going to help mitigate the effects and slow down the effects of climate change. And while that might be true, there's lots and lots of problems with these. First of all, they tend to be large, basically greenwashing projects where they sound good on paper, and companies are able to buy into this to sort of offset their own emissions. But there's very little follow through. There's lots of disorganization in how these plantings are undertaken. And so companies basically get away with still emitting their emissions and not really having contributed to any sort of meaningful project, while they get the PR benefits of looking like they're doing something for it. But then there's other issues like, you can't plant trees everywhere. Not everywhere should even have trees. I mean, the whole world shouldn't be forested. It's not naturally forested, and so it wouldn't make sense to have a global forest. So this reading really highlights some of the issues with some of these. So read through that and keep working your way through the module. But this is the last module, so I will not see you next week. But keep an eye out because I will be sending out some announcements talking about sort of what's coming next as far as the final and the study guide and those details wrapping up the semester. So I hope you've enjoyed this course. I've enjoyed teaching it, and I'm looking forward to getting your thoughts on everything, and hope you guys have a great end of your semester.